Well, hello everyone. If you are planning on following along today, today's message is going to be from John chapter 11. Now, if you're sitting there at the church this morning and watching this video, you would have noticed that the gospel reading today was John chapter 11, verses 1 through 27. Now, if you're at home and you're watching this, I would ask that you please stop the video, read John chapter 11, verses 1 through 27, and then start the video again, okay? Because this is a rather long story in John, and so kind of broken up the reading, right? For those who are at the church, or those of you who are at home, that I don't want to take up a lot of your time by reading everything, because generally speaking, I try and keep things at around 20 to 25 minutes, so reading takes up a bunch of that time. So when we look at John chapter 11, starting in verse 1, this is a story that a lot of us are familiar with if we're Christians, and we've been a Christian for some time now. If you're new to this story, in John chapter 11, we see that Jesus has gone away from Jerusalem, right? He's out where John the Baptist used to do his thing, used to baptize people and have a ministry. And Jesus has gone there because the last time he was in Jerusalem, the Pharisees were going to stone him for blasphemy. And so he's left with his disciples, and he's there, and it says that there's a man named Lazarus who's become sick. Now, Lazarus is a friend of Jesus, and he's the brother of sisters Martha and Mary, who in your Bible, there's other stories with Martha and Mary that you'll find within your Bible. Now, Lazarus had become sick, and Mary and Martha have sent word to Jesus saying, hey, Lazarus is sick, we need you to come and heal him. This tells you that Lazarus' sickness wasn't like the common flu, or it wasn't maybe a cold, right? It was pretty serious because they're looking for Jesus to come. And in the text, if you've read it or you listened to it during the gospel reading today, it says that they sent word to him. And when Jesus heard this, in verse 4, it says that the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. This is kind of important part, right? The Bible tells us that Jesus was friends with them, that he loved them. But when he heard about the sickness, he said, it's not going to end in death. And 2 days later, he looks to the disciples and he says, hey, okay, we're going to go to Judea. And the disciples go, what do you mean we're going to Judea? The last time we were there, they're going to stone you. Like, we shouldn't go back there. They're trying to kill you there. And Jesus says to them, what? Lazarus has gone to sleep. They go, oh, that's great. Good for him. He'll work up when he's rested and he'll be better. We don't need to go there because Lazarus is asleep. Now, a lot of times, we miss this and think that the disciples are just being a little bit daft, but that's not the case, right? Because Jesus said it's not going to end in death. And then he turns around and says, well, we're going to see him now because he's sleeping, right? Now, there is an idiom in Judaism that would say that when they say somebody has gone to sleep, it means that they've died. But Jesus also told his disciples that this wouldn't end in death. So you can see why they're not putting together that him saying that he's gone to sleep means that he's actually dead. But Jesus does come and he's very direct with them and says that Lazarus has died. Right after the disciples had said, hey, the last time you were there, we're going to stone you. We shouldn't go back. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. He's saying to them that, hey, we need to go. There's work to be done. God's work needs to be done. In fact, earlier it said that God needs to be glorified by what's going to be happening. And so they're going to go. And it's interesting at the very end, after saying these things and telling the disciples that Lazarus has actually died, Thomas makes this comment in verse 16. Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now, I've read Bible commentaries that say that that's Thomas being courageous and let's do this. I don't see that way, right? I see it almost as a sarcastic comment, right? They were concerned that if they go there, that Jesus is going to be stoned. They don't think it's a good idea. And Jesus gives his reasoning, and Thomas says, well, let's go then. We might as well get killed right along with Jesus. Right? That's how I see this comment. You might see it a little bit differently, and that's okay. But the way I hear it, the way Thomas has said it, that's kind of what I see in that he's being a little sarcastic. Remember, this is the guy that says, I won't believe unless I stick my hand in his side and see the nail prints for myself. Right? Thomas is prone to some extremes and maybe a little bit of sarcasm. So anyway, they make their way to Bethany, right? And if you're not aware, Bethany is like 2, maybe 3 miles at most east of Jerusalem. It's where Mary and Martha and Lazarus live. And it says that as they get there, a bunch of Jews have come out of Jerusalem to comfort Mary and Martha. And so when they get there and they're outside of the village, it says that Martha comes out to meet with Jesus. Now, the exchange that Martha has with Jesus is interesting. Starting in verse 20, it says, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. So there's a couple things that we know about Martha. Martha is probably a little more pragmatic than her sister Mary. She has her emotions under control. But in this, I see that she's almost kind of being a little passive-aggressive towards Jesus. Almost like, well, we sent word to you because we knew that you could heal him, but since you didn't show up in time, now he's dead. I'm saying that very crassly. But Martha and Mary believed that if Jesus showed up, that Lazarus was not going to die, that he'd still be alive. And I can see her almost being a little bit, rough in the way she says it to Jesus. Right? A lot of times we read these things and we don't try and associate emotions with what's going on around them, but there are. And so Martha's kind of holding it in a little bit and saying, hey, if you would have been here, everything would have been okay, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. So she's kind of hinting at, well, if you had showed up in the first place, you wouldn't have died, but since you're here now, maybe if you ask God, you can do something about it still. Right? She's showing that she has some faith in Messiah, but not complete faith in Messiah. And we see that in the very next paragraph that is read about her, right? Jesus answers and says, your brother will rise again. Jesus is talking in the very immediate future, but Martha says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Martha believes in Jesus, but she still doesn't believe in Jesus. She knows that he's the Messiah. She knows that he's something more, but she still hasn't come to the realization that he is God incarnate in the flesh, that he is filled to bring me with the Holy Spirit, and anything that he asks for can be done. She still doesn't have that realization. She hasn't given herself completely over to knowing who Jesus is. A lot of us as Christians go through the same thing. We believe in God. When something we can see coming is going to happen, we start praying to God, hey, God, can you X? And then when it doesn't go our way, we're almost accusatory toward God and going, well, I know you could have handled that, but why didn't you show up? And when God says to us, well, it's going to turn out exactly the way I want it to turn out, and we still don't believe. Right? Just a simple lesson from this whole thing is when we give ourselves completely over to God's plan, it makes life a whole lot easier. When we believe in Him 100%, even in the rough times, even when the bad things happen, life becomes much simpler. But she says, I know He's going to rise again at some point in time, right? The belief that when the Messiah comes, that the dead in Christ would rise again, or that the dead saints of Judaism would rise up when the Messiah comes. She believes that, but she still isn't seeing the big picture that He's going to raise Lazarus right now. He said to her, I am the resurrection and life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the God who has come into the world. So she's saying that she believes in Him, just like the disciples have. And they kind of do, but they kind of don't. I hope you understand where I'm going with that. Right? They know who He is, but they don't understand what that means and the impact that that's going to have. And so Jesus gives her this really answer that's kind of a parable in a way. And she says, yes, I believe that you are the Son who has come into the world. Now, after that conversation, I'm going to read to you the next portion, starting at verse 28. This is when Mary comes into the picture. It says, and after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. Notice she didn't say the Messiah is here. She says the teacher and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Notice in the beginning, they didn't follow Martha out to see Jesus, but now they're following Mary out because they think that she's going to the tomb. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, this is the same thing that Martha said. If you'd been here, you wouldn't have died. Now, she does it in a different way, right? Martha is very pragmatic about it. Martha is very almost stoic about what she's saying. But not Mary. Mary's very emotional. Mary's hurt. Right? I'm not saying that she's an emotional in a bad way. Right? She lost her brother. She's crying. She's hurt. She's devastated. She falls at Jesus' feet, and she's accusatory to him too and says, if you would have just been here, he wouldn't be dead. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? And he asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Now everybody else is thinking the same thing. Man, he obviously loved him. Why didn't he come and heal him? Now I want you to go all the way back to the beginning of this chapter. What does Jesus say? This will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus knows what's going to happen the whole time. And he lets his friend die. right now, to us, that seems unfathomable. Right? To let someone you love and care for die. I'm here to tell you today that Jesus didn't want this to happen. But he knew that it had to happen for God's will to be shown, so that they would understand that he was the Messiah. They needed to see the completeness of his power by resurrecting somebody or rising somebody from the dead. And you might say, well, boy, earlier in the Bible, right, there are stories about other places where he brought people back from life. There's a difference here. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Jewish culture believes that it takes 3 days before you're actually 100% dead. Any rising of people from the dead or bringing people back or resuscitating people prior to 3 days isn't considered resurrecting somebody from the dead. It's just that simple. It's Jewish culture. That's what they believed. And so, although he did bring people back to life, it's not considered what's going to happen here. I hope you understand that. If not, give me a call. We can talk about it a little bit more deeply. So, Lazarus dies. This is for God's glory. Now, Jesus sets aside everything to do exactly what God has asked him to do. Right? A lot of times people think that Jesus wept because Mary was weeping. When Jesus heard that Lazarus was dead in his spirit, he knew that was sick. He knew that he had to let him die. And I'm telling you, folks, this made him sad. This hurt. And it's another lesson that we have to learn in our Christian journey, that sometimes the way we think things need to be done or the result that we want from God has to come a different way for reasons that we don't understand. But we need to be willing to trust in God that they're going to be done just as he has laid forth. You notice, even though he says to the disciples, this will not end in death, and then tells them that Lazarus has died, they're not expecting him to raise Lazarus from the dead. Martha kind of wants him to raise him from the dead, but she doesn't actually think that's what's going to happen. Mary also does not say, you're going to raise him from the dead. None of them do. And so Jesus is emotional. It hurts him to see his friends hurting. It hurts him that he had to let his friend die, but he did it anyway. So that the Jewish people in the area, the ones that followed Mary out, can see that he is actually the Son of God. That's what this is all about. Proof that he is the Son of God. In fact, they asked the same questions. Well, he opened the eyes of the blind man. Couldn't he have kept him from dying? They don't say, well, surely he healed the blind man, so surely he can bring him back to life. They didn't realize what it meant to receive the Messiah. Okay, further. Verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. Notice, once more, deeply moved. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. You would think at this point in time that Jesus going to the tomb and asking it to be rolled away, that like Mary and Martha go, holy cow, maybe he's going to, but her answer isn't, oh cool, he's going to raise him from the dead. It's, he's going to smell bad by now. If you don't understand the practices of the day, it ties in exactly with what happened with Jesus. Right? When people die there, they wash their bodies. They might put some perfumes and ointments on it. And they wrap it. And they put it in a cave and cover it up. And so through natural processes, eventually the body is going to be consumed. Right? Not by people, but through natural processes, until the point where it's basically bones. So eventually they go back sometime later and collect those bones. They put it in an ossuary, and they put it in a family place where they keep the remains of the dead, the bones of the dead, and that cave is then used again. That's actually what would have happened with Jesus as well if he wouldn't have been resurrected and ascended to heaven. So this is what's going on. He's in there, he's starting to decay, he's starting to smell bad. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you would always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. All the way back at the beginning of chapter 11, I'm sure when he hears that Lazarus is sick in his spirit, he knows that Lazarus is going to die. He says, Lord, let's not let him die. And God tells him the plan. And he says, Lord, Father, I trust in you. And I'm going to do exactly what you tell me to do. And so he goes there and he makes sure that they understand that this is an act of God. That's why he says it out loud. He wants them to understand that this is an act of God so that God would be glorified. When he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave cloths and let him go. Right? This is the culmination. This is so that people would believe in him. Right? And next week, we're going to look at the triumphal entry, and you're going to see in John chapter 12 that it says, there are many who came to believe because of what he did with Lazarus. It was the final straw. It's shortly before Passover. This miracle had to be done, and people had to see it, and they had to know that Lazarus has died. And man, could have God done this with any other person? Sure, he could have. But he didn't. Why? Because it made it more personal. They could see that Jesus was willing to sacrifice his own emotions, the things that were going to hurt him. He was willing to sacrifice so that God could be glorified. And just like Jesus calling out Lazarus from the dead, he says, take off those clothes and go. Right? When we come to Jesus and we start finally relying on him completely, not just saying, hey, I believe, but really understanding what it means to give our hearts and our lives to Jesus Christ, to give them over to him completely. He says, get up out of there, take those old clothes off. You don't have to worry anymore. Because there is a difference between believing that Jesus is Messiah and understanding what that means and giving everything to him and having a personal relationship with him and giving our emotions to him and our desires to him, and no matter what, trusting that what's going to happen is for God's glory and not our own. Because this is a tumultuous event. It's a big event in the life of Jesus. One of the biggest. In fact, you'll see in verse 45 it says, and I'm just going to read this a little bit and then we're going to be done. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. Some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. The chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation would perish." This event is really what pushed things over the top. And we're going to see that moving forward from different perspectives. So I thank you for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed this message. Hopefully you saw the story a little bit different. And I hope God just absolutely blesses you this week and that you're willing to come back again next week. Have a great week.